February 1897, a British naval officer stood inside a palace in West Africa and looked at thousands of cast bronze flags covering the walls, all extremely detailed and precise works of art and craftsmanship, most of which were centuries old, and wrote in his official report that such level of craftsmanship could only be possible with foreign influence. What he saw on that fateful day wasn't evidence of foreign influence or training of any kind. It was simply the work of a local bronze casting guild known as erasure. This guild had been operating in that one city for roughly 500 years, refining a casting technique so precise that today some of those same pieces sit in the British Museum, the Met, and the Smithsonian. And museums across the world are currently in the process of giving them back to their original owners. This is the story of the Benin Kingdom bronze casting industry. How it was built, how it was almost erased in a single week of violence, and why, more than a century later, it is still making headlines today. The Kingdom of Benin, not the modern country of Benin, but an entirely separate West African kingdom located in what is now southern Nigeria, had by the 1400s established one of the most sophisticated bronze casting traditions in the world. The technique is known as wax casting. In this technique, the caster would sculpt the design in wax, encase it in clay, melt the wax out through a channel, pour in molten bronze, then break the clay away to reveal the finished piece. It is a technique that demands precision at every single stage. You get clay temperature wrong or the pour wrong and the entire piece is useless. The casters in the Benin Kingdom did this at such a level of perfection that was enough to produce thousands of plaques and other commemorative and ceremonial pieces. Over centuries, they organized under a dedicated guild, the erasure, whose members lived in a designated quarter of the city and answered directly to the Oba, the supreme ruler of the Benin Kingdom. Membership into the guild was hereditary, and their techniques were closely guarded. This wasn't a DIY or hobby-based craft. It was state-sponsored industrial production with intense quality control, specialization, and an unbroken chain of craftsmanship passed down for roughly 5 centuries. By the time European traders started arriving on the West African coast in the late 1400s, Benin City itself was already large and highly organized, enough that Dutch visitors in the 1600s described it as comparable in scale to some of the major cities of Europe at the time. So, how did an industry this established, this protected, almost disappear in a single week? By the 1890s, Britain was aggressively expanding its trade and colonial control along the West African coast under the Niger Coast Protectorate. However, the Oba of Benin was still restricting British trade access, and he maintained control over key trade routes. This was, of course, a direct obstacle to British commercial interests in the region. In January 1897, a British delegation attempted to enter Benin City despite being told not to do so, especially as it was during an important religious ceremony. Unfortunately for both sides, this visit ended in an ambush, and most of the delegation was killed with only a few officers, who managed to escape back to their base to tell their story. Britain's response was immediate and disproportionate. Within weeks after the ambush, Britain organized what it officially called the Punitive expedition, a large military force that invaded Benin City in February 1897. Needless to say, the city was captured, the Oba was exiled, and the palace complex, including the rooms housing centuries of bronze plaques, ivory carvings, and ceremonial objects, was looted and burned. Somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 individual pieces were removed from the city in the aftermath of that invasion. Many of these pieces were shipped back to Britain, where a portion of them were sold at auction, reportedly in part to help cover the cost of the expedition itself, meaning that the objects were used to fund the very same military operation that seized them. The destruction wasn't incidental. The scale of looting was so large and so well organized that it effectively became one of the largest and most documented cases of colonial-era cultural appropriation on record. This was thousands of individually crafted, centuries-old works dispersed across dozens of institutions and private collections almost overnight. Now, this is where the story gets an extra layer of injustice that most people never get to hear. When these bronzes started appearing in European museums and private collections, many scholars initially refused to believe that the supposedly primitive West Africans had made them. The technical sophistication, the precision of the casting, the clear detailing of the figures, the scale of production simply didn't match the racist assumptions of that era about African civilizations. Some early European commentators speculated that the pieces must have been made with help from ancient Mediterranean cultures, or Portuguese craftsmen, or some other outside influence. Anything other than crediting the Benin Guild directly. It took decades of further scholarship and direct engagement with the oral histories of the Igbo Ero, as well as their continued practice to fully correct the record. So the industry wasn't just looted, its very existence was for a time actively disputed by the very same people who took it. However, the guild never actually stopped working, even after the looting. The same techniques, refined over centuries, are still practiced today by descendants of the same guild members in the same quarter of what is now Benin City, the capital of Edo State, Nigeria. So why is this still news today? Now, this is why this isn't just a 19th century story. Over the past several years, museums and governments across the world have been in active negotiations and, in a growing number of cases, actual handovers to return Benin bronze artworks to Nigeria. This is one of the most closely watched restitution cases in the museum world, precisely because the paper trail is so clear. There are detailed documentations of the 1897 expedition, of what was taken, and of where individual pieces ended up. It has become a central case study in the broader ongoing global debate over whether looted cultural pieces should stay in the institutions that have held them for over a century or be returned to their places of origin. So when you look at a Benin bronze in a museum today, you are not just looking at a beautiful object. You are looking at the surviving evidence of a 500-year-old industrial guild, a week of colonial violence that tried to erase it, decades of scholars who refused to believe it was real, and a restitution process that is still actively unfolding in the news right now.